Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. A little later, we're going to talk about corporate welfare. Maybe left and right can finally meet on something. But first, a friend of mine from Mountain States Legal Foundation, Perry Pendley. Perry, good to see you again.
Great to see you, Jon. Thanks for having me on.
Before we get on to the book,
Right.
Mountain States Legal Foundation is this great organization. I'm glad you guys have been around, and you do legal work, and you've been doing this for years. You're a public advocacy group, and you do it for the free market.
Exactly. We're a nonprofit, public interest legal foundation. We represent people who cannot afford an attorney. We fight for individual liberty, the right to own and use property, limited ethical government, and the free enterprise system. We take on the federal government most of the time.
And you don't charge your clients.
Don't charge a client.
Which is good because I
can't charge a client.
I've got a small DUI problem I'd like to talk to you about.
Yeah, well, I can refer you to a lawyer.
I'm sure you could. And you guys have done great work, and because of that, you've done a lot of land use issue over the years about how people can use their lands. And your latest book, and you're getting very prolific now, is it your fourth book from Regnery this time, Sagebrush Rebel, about Ronald Reagan and environmentalism. Now this is a bit of an untold story. So I'm always fascinated by the Reagan years, and now they're becoming things of folklore. But Colorado has kind of an interesting tie to the Department of Interior, and including in Reagan's time. What was that?
Oh, absolutely. His Secretary of the Interior, first Secretary of the Interior, Jim Watt, who was the first president of Mountain States Legal Foundation. And
your organization.
Absolutely. And he was brought into Washington to be Reagan's first Secretary of the Interior. Reagan's first nominee was Cliff Hansen, my old boss, senator from Wyoming. Hansen couldn't take the job, and Jim Watt did because he knew the agency, he knew the bureaucracy, he'd worked on Capitol Hill, he'd worked
even though he was out here running for the first time Mountain States Legal, your group.
Exactly. He had been in Washington, came out here, was the first president of Mountain States Legal Foundation, and frankly suing the Department of Interior, suing the Forest Service and other agencies, and that Reagan took him to Washington.
Now, I was a young man at that point, but I was starting to get politically aware.
Right.
And out of all the cabinet members, James Watt stood out to me because he looked like such a geek. All right, he had these bald head, which now I find out is very, very attractive. Exactly. But back then it wasn't. With these big Coke bottle glasses, he looked like a complete dweeb, a complete geek. Was he?
No, absolutely not. He was a very sharp guy. He knew the agency. He was an excellent manager. For someone who'd been staff all of his life, I'd been a staff man most of my life. And he was a perfect staff man's guy because he would listen to staff and he would make decisions. I'll tell you, the agency, 80,000 people at the Department of Interior loved him, essentially because when they came in with an issue, he would make a decision. He wasn't one of these guys who put stuff on back burners and say, well, let's decide later. He decided stuff.
Why was he so hated? I mean, out of all the guys who were catching fire, and there were lots of guys catching fire back then, he took more arrows, I think, than anybody else in Reagan's cabinet.
A couple of reasons. Number one, Reagan was untouchable. Reagan was a guy that just because of a pure personality and his popularity, the media, the environmental groups, the people, the Democrats on Capitol Hill couldn't go after Reagan. So they went after somebody who was vulnerable, and they went after Watt. Reagan said Watt had an unfortunate habit of sticking his foot in his mouth, and he did. But Reagan also said that Jim was a victim of a 2.5-year lynching by the environmental groups and the media.
Why? What did he do that hacked off Enviros?
Well, he did exactly 180 out from what they wanted to do. What they wanted to do was not drill on federal lands, and Reagan wanted to drill on federal lands. A third of the country is owned by the federal government, 1 billion acres on the Outer Continental Shelf owned by the government.
Slow down there, because this is hard for people to get.
Right.
A third of the country.
A third of the country.
A third of the country is owned by the
federal government, exactly.
So next time,
half of Colorado, half of Wyoming, 85% of Idaho. It's huge. It's huge. Federal land is huge, and because of where it's located, which is in the Rocky Mountain West, its potential for oil and gas development, mineral development is very big. And Reagan knew that. He knew to solve the economic problem, solve our foreign affairs problem, solve our energy problem, we had to develop energy, and he believed it had to come from federal lands. And Watt said, aye, aye, sir, and moved ahead to develop those energy sources.
Jim Watt hate the environment? Was he a guy who wanted to pave over paradise, chop down the trees, and stick in parking lots? What?
Yeah, he's a real Western guy. He's a grandson of homesteaders. He loved the land, was an outdoor kind of guy, loved to camp and fish and do all that sort of thing. But at the same time, his job, Secretary of the Interior, required a person to be both a developer and a preserver. You had to conserve land and use it. Conservation means wise use, and you can also preserve it. And Jim Watt was committed to preservation. Reagan was committed to preservation. He signed more wilderness laws than any president in history.
When you say Reagan signed more wilderness laws, right. First, I don't want anybody signing laws. I have a natural aversion to that. What does that mean, he signed wilderness laws?
Wilderness is a unique designation created in 1964 where some federal land is so beautiful, so unique, so untouched by man that Congress has decided it's going to preserve that land like that always. And the statutory phrase is where man is a stranger and does not remain. And so those lands are set aside. They're essentially places to hike and
really? So in other words,
visit.
There's no Starbucks allowed in the center of
Starbucks,
wilderness.
no drilling, no mining.
But the image of Reagan is the opposite of environmentalists, opposite of conservationists, opposite of somebody who would preserve and make wilderness lands. He was the guy who wanted to chop down the trees and make way for
That's the lie. That's the lie that they tell. And the reason the environmentalists lie about Reagan is because he was right on issues that they pretend to care about.
Like what?
Like wilderness lands. They want more wilderness lands. Reagan created more wilderness lands. Protect the parks. Reagan protected the parks. Make more wildlife refuges. Reagan created more wildlife refuges. But environmentalists don't want to say that Reagan did a great job, because if he did a great job on those issues, maybe what he did on oil and gas and mining and coal, maybe that was good too, and they don't want to say that.
All right. Why now? Why? I mean, there's a lot of tributes to Reagan, but this is not as much a tribute to Reagan as a warning today. What are you trying to get across?
Well, it's an untold story. Nobody ever told this story. I thought Watt, I thought Clark, I thought Hodel, and Judge Clark passed away just last week.
And by the way, for those who are just listening, those were the secretaries of Interior under Reagan.
Ronald
it was
Reagan.
Watt and then Clark.
Judge Clark, Bill Clark, and then Paul Hodel.
Who still lives in Colorado.
Exactly.
And then years later, it was our friend Gail Norton who became Secretary of Interior. So Colorado and Department of Interior are very well tied.
Good connection. I thought one of them would write the book, never wrote the book. And so I thought, no one's told this story. I wanted to tell the story. And when you look at what's happening now in 2013, it looks exactly like what was happening in 1980. And so, Obama always likes to compare himself to Reagan. So what I did with every single chapter was compare what Ronald Reagan did and what Obama's doing right now, and say, we got to go back to what Reagan did.
Let's play that game for a little bit.
Right.
So I remember 1980.
Right.
It was a very good year for me in high school. And, life was carefree. Reagan came into office, and he was there to destroy the environment. And today, why are we in the same position? What is the same in 1980 and 2013?
What's happening is we're not drilling on federal lands. This miracle, again, as happened back then, we've had the hydraulic fracturing that's going on across the country, where we've discovered massive amounts of natural gas all across the country. It's happening on private land, it's happening on state land, it's not happening on federal land, because to get a permit on federal land takes 230 days, to get it on private land takes 30 days. And so little wonder that industry is going on to private property instead of on the federal land.
Is that a bad thing?
It's a terrible thing.
Why?
Because federal lands have a tremendous energy potential. It's a third of the country. It's not all parks. It's not all wilderness areas. Much of it is areas where we ought to be drilling for energy resources. And to lay those areas off and prevent us from developing them, we could solve a lot of problems, especially in western states. I mean, it's great in Pennsylvania that they're drilling for Marcellus gas on private property, but here in Colorado and up in Wyoming, where we'd like to be doing some more drilling to help our economies, we can't do it. And so Obama's preventing that. Reagan took us on the path to 1 billion tons of coal produced in the United States. Obama's declared war on coal.
Well, let's stop there for a second, though. Coal is the most stable energy source we have.
Correct.
It's the cheapest energy source, but it is, by most people's thought, the ugliest of energy sources. And not only do you scar the land when you surface mine it, but then you burn it and put all that CO2 in there. So a war on coal now, opening up to natural gas, isn't that just a wonderful transition? Why is that a war?
Well, it's a war because Obama's declared a war on coal, because he says you can build a coal-fired power plant if you want, but I'm going to bankrupt you. And that's exactly what's going on.
Through regulatory costs and hurdles and costs of compliance.
And it's killing small communities. Ever since the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act was passed in 1977, we have been reclaiming these coal lands. It's not the bad old days. It's not the old Appalachian days. We are reclaiming these lands after the coal is mined in Wyoming, in Montana, in the Appalachian country. But Obama just doesn't want the coal mined. Plus, our air quality regulations, the coal that's mined in Wyoming and Montana, for example, is what we call compliance coal. You can meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act by burning that western coal. And because of the technological advances, we can also burn eastern coal in the same way. So you're cutting off a huge, it's economically devastating to vast regions of the country to have a federal government war on coal. Plus, we are the Saudi Arabia of coal. Why cut off one of our arms?
I get what's hard for me to understand is
Yes.
that, so coal is awful, nuclear is awful, therefore we haven't built a new nuke plant in how many decades, and now gas is awful because it requires fracking. So you can't mine the coal,
right,
and you can't poke a hole in the ground,
right,
to use a technology that's been around for 80 years. What would Reagan do?
What would Reagan?
Let me do that question. What would Reagan do?
Well, there's this pipeline that we keep talking about all the time. We wouldn't be talking about that. Reagan would have done that. And Reagan would make sure we were drilling on federal lands. And Reagan would not be imposing new federal government regulations on fracking across the country like Obama's doing. Obama's plan to impose new fracking regulations on the states, and by the way, this whole fracking thing has been regulated by the states for more than 60 years, is going to impose a cost of $245 million annually. And it's going to be devastating to the industry. It's going to cost jobs, and Reagan wouldn't have anything to do with that. Reagan believed in human potential. He believed that people could solve problems.
But how did Reagan, if he said we can open up these lands, we can lease a third of the country or open up some of it to leasing so that we can extract these incredible forms of energy.
Right.
How does that jive with Reagan as a conservationist and a preserver? Now, we all see the images of him whacking down his sagebrush with his chainsaw. Those were wonderful things down at the ranch. But really, how can both of those things be true of Reagan?
Well, both of those things be true because we've got so much federal land. It's a third of the country. And so you've got parklands, you've got wilderness lands, and then you've got huge expanses of Bureau of Land Management lands and U.S. Forest Service lands that are what we call multiple use lands. They're supposed to be used for a variety of purposes, including oil and gas and minerals. And so you can have it all. You can protect the parks, you can protect the wilderness areas, and you can drill for energy.
You sound like some woman in 1973. You could just have it all.
You can have it all.
Yeah, here we were. Tell me, what is a Sagebrush Rebel? That's a story I don't know.
What happened was that back in 1980, in 76, when Jimmy Carter came in, Jimmy Carter was the first environmental president. He was the first president beholden to environmental groups. He brought a lot of the environmentalists into his administration, and they declared war on the West. War on cowboys, get the cattle off the range, no oil and gas, no mining. They didn't want water controlled by Western states. Westerners have controlled their water since gold was panned in California. And all of a sudden the federal government said, no, we want to be in charge of your water rights. And the reaction was furious in the West. It wasn't a partisan issue because you had Democrats like Lamb of Colorado, Babbitt of Arizona, Matheson of Utah, Hirschler of Wyoming, all Democrats opposed Jimmy Carter and Cecil Anderson and what they were doing. That's what we call the war on the West. And it resulted,
Sagebrush Rebel?
and the Sagebrush Rebel was against the war in the West and fighting against Anderson, fighting against Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan went to groups all across the West, said, I'm a Sagebrush Rebel. I'm one of you. I'm going to Washington. I'm going to get a sagebrush solution. And within less than a year after Reagan got to Washington, the rebellion came to an end. He quelled the rebellion. We now have a new rebellion. We have Sagebrush Rebellion 2, thanks to Barack Obama.
Incredible. All right, the story right here, Sagebrush Rebel. Get it before the movie is out. You sold the rights to the movie, so it's going to be incredible. Who's going to star you in it?
We're working on it. We're in negotiations.
Perry, thank you. You stay tuned.
Thanks, John.